All right. Happy Friday. I hope everyone is staying cool. It's extremely hot out here. Welcome to Emancipations podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Tutt. I'm joined by Kolya Ludwig, socialist thinker, DSA member in Los Angeles, currently in Seattle, and a former group member of several of our study groups. Welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me. And actually, that intro video you made reminds me that there's a statue in Seattle of Lenin, a famous statue,
Yep.
just a few blocks from where I grew up here. And every time I'm back, I check it out to see if there's been any vandalism on it.
Right.
And if you're in Seattle, I only come up here a few times a year. If you just get a can of bronze spray paint from Lowe's or Home Depot, you can
fix it.
clean them back up. So
Right.
I haven't checked him out yet this time. I'll go over there probably after this session and make sure he's looking sharp.
I love it. That's awesome. And so look, we're doing these Friday streams. It's a great blessing to sort of bring together philosophers, political militants, communists, people really seriously interested in looking at questions of theory and practice. Kolya had written a piece, and I shared this in the Patreon as well as in our Discord, in Cosmonaut, which was a very comradely and very constructive critique of the Marxist Unity Group, which we can explain the Marxist Unity Group. It's a tendency that I've talked about and that I've been very drawn to for many years now within DSA, within the Democratic Socialists of America. And it's a very robust and very serious sort of effort, which I think we both have a lot of praiseworthy things to say about it. So one of the things we want to do is talk about this sort of the strategy and perhaps, tease out some of Kolya's views regarding the limitations of what's called MUG or Marxist Unity Group. So that's one thing we want to do on this stream. The second thing we want to do on this stream is to introduce you all to a thinker by the name of Alan Shandro, who is a Leninist theoretician who wrote a very cool book called Lenin and the Logic of Hegemony, published with H.M. Brill. I think it's available in the paperback version through Haymarket, so you can get it at a reasonable price. Obviously, the concept of hegemony we're most familiar through Antonio Gramsci's work, but post-Marxism has come onto the scene, and specifically, the hegemony theory of Laclau and Mouffe, socialism, hegemony and socialist strategy, rather, from really, I guess, the late 1980s, has, I think, fundamentally reconceptualized or reorganized the way that we tend to look at the concept of hegemony. So there's a lot of questions about the concept itself that we want to get into. Concurrent to that, Mike McNair and Lars Lih are two thinkers that have reintroduced Leninism for practical Marxist politics in our time. And Lenin Rediscovered, Lars Lih's interpretation of what is to be done, is an extremely great example of this very, I think, thorough analysis of what actually was Lenin's intervention, what is to be done, and how might we understand the Marxist movement in relationship to social democracy. So couldn't be more pertinent, couldn't be more relevant. Alan Shandro emerges, and I think Kolya does a nice job of sort of framing his contribution in this way. He sort of emerges as offering a different way, a method of reading Lenin other than what we come to know as the quote-unquote neo-Kautskyist view. The Marxist historian Doug Green has a very interesting new book, and I will hopefully interview Doug on this, that is a criticism of neo-Kautskyism. I'm not sure, Kolya, if you're familiar with it. I've had Doug on before to talk about his book on Stalin and his book on Michael Harrington. So Alan Shandro represents, I think, another Marxist criticism of neo-Kautskyism implicitly, although perhaps he's not as direct as you are in using some of his insights to push against neo-Kautskyism. So that's our sort of agenda. That's sort of, perhaps that is an ambitious agenda. Perhaps this is something we can actually achieve. Welcome to comrades that are joining. Let us actually begin, Kolya, if I could, with a conversation on Shandro's work, why it's important to you, and maybe you could identify a couple salient themes that emerge from this book, which I have finished well over half of it, but it's a big book. I mean, it's not an intimidating work. It's very readable, I would say, and it's really exceptional, I think, because he's getting into questions such as the Kautskyan merger thesis, the relationship between intellectuals and workers. The one thing that I very much appreciate about the text, right, is this notion about a defense of consciousness from without, from quote unquote, from without. This famous Leninist, the core idea of the Leninist vanguard theory. And he sort of pieces together a defense of it that does not reinforce a lot of the prejudices that many people assign to Lenin's vanguard theory, that it's elitist, etc. Right? He does a masterful job there. I think the other masterful job that he does, and this gets to the heart of where he differs from Lars Lih, is he sort of shows the intricate ways that Lenin is breaking from social democracy and from Kautskyism in certain ways. So anyways, those are some first impressions, but I'll turn it over to you to share your thoughts about its contributions.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah, I think you're right. He has many interlocutors, Alan Shandro, not just the neo-Kautskyan perspective, although he does have an appendix at the back of the book where he gets a little bit more into Lars Lih, which is interesting. But yeah, I think he's engaging with definitely Laclau move, as you mentioned, post-Marxism, as well as, I think, the Trotskyist diaspora, which I think has been really the dominant Leninism that we've had in the United States, at least, and probably in other parts of the West. And he's trying to engage all these perspectives and also put forward a positive perspective, a positive theory, a framework about Lenin. You had a nice series of interviews in a video you did a while back on the new book, Flowers for Marx, for which you wrote the foreword. And one of your guests, I think it was JP, was that his name? Had a nice answer to your question, which is, what is Marxism to you? And his answer was, Marxism comes with certain commitments. And I sort of asked myself, well, what are my commitments as a Marxist? And what are Alan Shandro's commitments, I think? And to me, I think the commitment that comes to mind is that to be a Marxist, you need to also develop a theory and practice of hegemony. You need to answer the question of how can socialism come to pass? And I do like Laclau and Mouffe's intervention, where they say that hegemony was the answer to a crisis in Marxism, where the logic of historical necessity was not bringing socialism into reality. The unfolding of capitalism and its own contradictions did not produce socialism. And so this opens the space for hegemony. And here, I think, is where Lenin intervenes and where we need to really interpret what Lenin did. So with Marx, we have the concept of class struggle, but we also have these other superstructural contradictions, which deviate from the general principles of Marxism, the epochal analysis of Marx. And it is these contingent crises which often prove decisive in history. And this is acknowledged by Marx himself and many Marxists after him. There's nothing new here. And I think this begs the question, if we have these contingent crises, which surprise us as Marxists in any conjuncture, what is the task of the subject in such situations? And it is here, I think, that we need Lenin. We need an understanding of Lenin to understand this. And I actually just opened up this pamphlet that Lukács wrote on Lenin last night. My brother let me borrow this thing. And he says something interesting. He says that with Lenin, we grasp the momentous connection between individual actions and general destiny. And I think this is the challenge that Lenin raises, is how can the subject act in the conjuncture to fight for socialism? And here I think I want to get into Alan Shandro's argument. So the basic way that I think we can frame Alan Shandro's argument is that Leninism is socialism and the art of war, effectively. And he calls Lenin's contribution to political theory the politico-strategic logic of the struggle for hegemony, kind of a mouthful. I like to shorten that to the strategic logic of hegemony, which I think captures basically what he's saying. And so here I have basically 5 points that I think we can consolidate Shandro's argument down to, although he says many more things that are important, of course. So Marxism is the recognition of the primacy and irreconcilability of class struggle and its necessary negation by the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat can only mean the hegemony of the proletariat at the expense of the bourgeoisie over the main struggles of the day, the main social struggles of the day. And Lukács has another nice quote here, actually, where he says that every question of the day, precisely as a question of the day, becomes a fundamental problem of the revolution. Third thing, the struggle for socialism will therefore traverse every class, every social layer, and every aspect of society, not just the capital-labor relation. Fourth thing, the vanguard is the conscious element responsible for shouldering the strategic burden of the project for workers' power. And so this means, in Shandro's words, forging an instrument capable of grasping the present. Number 5, last thing, hegemony is thus an immediate question, not a future prospect. And I think this is really the point where Shandro departs from the dominant theories of hegemony within Marxism today. I think that, I told you before the stream, I just got back from Socialism 2025. And I had said that it's changed a lot in the 20 years since the last time I attended that conference. And one of the interesting developments, which I think is actually a positive development, although it creates challenges, it creates both openings and challenges, is that you can see a sort of strange alliance in the ethos of the project, of the conference, between the Trotskyist wing, which was the absolutely dominant wing of the conference in previous years, with kind of a new abolitionism, kind of a post-Black Lives Matter moment of abolitionism. And I think, that might seem strange, but I think that what these perspectives share is the idea that socialism is somewhere up ahead. And this is a nice framing that Shandro gives us, that this idea that socialism will come through some divine surprise in the future, some clarifying crisis. And this is absolutely not the perspective of Alan Shandro. For Alan Shandro, hegemony is an immediate question, something to be fought for right now, with all the complexities of the moment, with all the inadequacies of the present conjuncture, all the frustrations that we think are impasses right now. Now, I think this is a sort of cold, calculating view of Lenin. My friend who I organize with in Los Angeles has a nice addition to Shandro's argument, which is, I think we also need to think of Lenin as the passionate Lenin. the Lenin that defies rationality. And I think we do need to make theoretical room for this passionate Lenin, at the same time that we take up the Lenin of the strategic logic of hegemony. So maybe I can leave my answer there for now, and we can work through some of that or move forward from there.
That's very helpful. Thanks for identifying those 5 points. They're all very well taken and very interesting. A couple things emerge here. The first is class independence in traditional Marxism has a certain limitation in this framework, in the sense that a cross-class alliance becomes necessary. And I think that is an essential point that I'm getting both from like your interpretation of Shandro's work, but also Leninism as such. And I mean, the whole unity of the peasantry and the working class necessitated the development of class consciousness beyond just the primary antagonism between capital and labor. And what you get, and I think this is why, Lukács is always so interested in this idea of allowing the proletariat to have a sort of relationality to the totality. And Leninism, really starting from his early text, What is to be done, I think moving forward from that, also, he really does retain this idea of a kind of expansive conception of class consciousness, where he often evokes this very nice image that the worker has a pedagogical task of understanding every class position in capitalist society, right? Obviously, part of this is born from the rise of monopoly capitalism and imperialism, and the way that exports the class struggle, and the way that there emerges a heterogeneity of social antagonisms that the working class must master, must come to. It's all about both this kind of pedagogical task of mastery on the one hand, which that is also what hegemony names it. It names that pedagogical task. Now, the merger thesis from Kautsky, I want to invite you to say something about this, because a big contribution, as I mentioned at the outset, of Shandro's interpretation of Lenin is sort of a recasting of this debacle, of this oftentimes what is a scandal to Marxism, internal to ourselves, but also our enemies use this, I think, against us, which is that we're always trying to figure out the relationship between intellectuals and workers, right? Lenin has the vanguard theory, but a lot of the neo-Kautskyists really don't invoke so much this notion of vanguard theory as much as they do the merger idea. Can you explain what that is? Can you then talk a bit about how Shandro frames the problem and what some of his prescriptions are? This, I think, is actually something that, Emancipations as a platform is, I think, strived to do, both by helping in an age in which the humanities are being destroyed by the corporatization of the university, by austerity. We're trying to offer a space for people to actually engage in study that's like affordable but also rigorous, and introducing people to scholars that have actually achieved a lot and are, accomplished in certain ways, right? And so that kind of egalitarian approach to pedagogy is, I think, essential for our work. Now, how is Shandro thinking the relationship between intellectuals and workers? He has quite a lot of interesting things to say about this. And he doesn't really quote Gramsci as much in his book, although a lot of it is almost like a retroactive reading of Lenin in the wake of Gramsci's massive imprint on the New Left, on Marxism, on post-Marxism, etc. So in a way, yeah, again, Lenin and Logic of Hegemony is this book that's trying to sort of make a new appraisal of the true Lenin, to bring out the kind of true Lenin, as you were hinting. And I do want to ask you later about this notion of war. I'm not sure if we will agree on this as a signifier, but let's open the can of worms, if that's the right phrase, of intellectuals and workers. How does Shandro approach this?
Yeah, good stuff. So yeah, I think first of all, I'm with you. I agree that the Marxist Unity Group, I mean, they really got me thinking about hegemony. I really appreciate what I appreciate about them. And they are the kind of neo-Kautskian caucus within DSA. They really take theory seriously. And they actually put forward a clear theory of hegemony. Now, I came around to the position of disagreeing with them, but it is an important thesis because it rejects a lot of the things that ended up amounting to failures in kind of the Trotskyist tradition, in my opinion. And I'm sure they would say the same thing. And so the Kautskian thesis involves this merger formula, as you said, which is that the task of the conscious intellectual is basically the pedagogical task of raising the consciousness of the proletariat to understand this irreconcilable antagonism, to understand the general principles of Marxism, effectively. And for them, this is a very patient process involving a prefigurative development of the working class party, which learns to govern through its own self-activity, its own independent activity in society. Now, Shandro, of course, departs from this. And for him, like you pointed out, consciousness is not just consciousness of the general principles of Marxism. Consciousness is actually consciousness of the reflexivity of the strategic struggle for socialism, and of the responsibility of leaders to fight for workers' power in the moment, in the conjuncture. So that means, like you said, class alliances. That means, and I think that the worker-peasant alliance is fetishized a little bit. And it's considered to be this artifact of an underdeveloped Russia in 1905. But in fact, I think there's something constitutive about that kind of alliance. Because, and this is what I argue in my article on Cosmonaut, which is a website associated with the Marxist Unity Group to a greater or lesser extent. I basically argue that, the idea that we can get out of the necessity of alliances by saying that, well, now we're in kind of a developed country and we have a more robust working class and capitalism has developed to the point where we don't need the peasants or whatever. I just disagree with this. I think that the necessity of taking up the task of leadership means leading sectors of the population that will either, and this is where I think this irreconcilable antagonism comes into play in terms of hegemony. These sectors of society, which are not necessarily proletarian and not necessarily bourgeois, will be led. They will be led politically by the ruling class or by our project for workers' power. And so we have a decision to make about whether we want to be the ones that fight for their interests or whether we want our enemies to fight for their interests. And that's just, I think, a strategic calculation that we have to make. And I think that the very process of making those calculations is the process of gaining consciousness for Alan Shandro. And so, in other words, it's not just the understanding of the texts of Marxism, it's the understanding of your responsible role in the development of a political project that can fight for workers' power. I think you asked a few more things there that I may not be coming to mind immediately, but maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. part of this, I think, is a clarification that Shandro tries to develop concurrent to this bigger debate about the merger formula. There's also this question about how Lenin approaches the problem of the spontaneity of working class consciousness and what is actually the meaning, famously, that left to themselves, workers will only develop up to what he called trade union consciousness. And that that will actually produce a situation in which the horizon of spontaneous demands of the working class will tend to be for making capitalism better, in essence. And this sort of, I guess you could say, is the heart of where intellectuals might come into play. And I want your take on this, insofar as Marxism would be the insertion of a insistence of something to take that consciousness to something like a next level. Now, you could respond to that by saying, well, wait a second. And this kind of goes back to your point about how we think the conjuncture in our moment. Like Derek Varn recently said to me, we would only wish that workers would have trade union consciousness. Wouldn't that be nice, right? In other words, you know, the question of hegemony, right, is dealing with that uneven lag in a premature class consciousness that we have to face with a certain degree of sobriety, right, as socialists, right, which immediately delinks us from Lenin's situation in a certain way. But I think that it also, Kolya, propels this idea that, well, what actually does it look like? And this is why I'm very compelled by your reading here. What does it actually look like to think of the working class forging alliances with other sectors, other classes that are also experiencing albeit in qualitatively different forms, often forms of domination, forms of exploitation, and forms of subsequently desperation, despair, dejection from capitalism. One could say, well, wait a second, isn't that what left populism does? Isn't left populism flawed because left populism is content to forge alliances with, and we saw how this worked with Syriza, we saw how this worked with Podemos. So that would actually be one question, right? Which is the Marxist insistence on class independence draws a starker line than left populism does in left populism's ease with forging class alliances. So like left populism probably wouldn't, in some variants, wouldn't have a problem with alliances with the petty bourgeoisie, for example. What I gather you to be saying is something slightly different than that, which is there's also a kind of heterogeneity of social struggles. There is like spontaneous consciousness is already embedded in social struggles. And you cite several examples, right? Where you sort of feel that like, yeah, well, class independence isn't able to align with these struggles in a certain way. So all of that is to ask you, like, have you thought about that? Like how left populism relates to this conception of Marxist hegemony that you're articulating here? And how might your view sort of distinguish itself from left populism? I imagine that that's very important to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I finally did read this, blacklisted book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. It's a great book. It's a fantastic book. It is an absolutely radical intervention that every Marxist should read. I mean, I just don't know how you can engage in a contemporary debate on hegemony without having read the book. I don't know how I was doing. I think I was getting second, like I was saying, I was using a lot of their language actually coming from somewhere. And I think part of it is Shandro's engagement with them. But yes, I mean, their radical contribution is to think hegemony in totally new terms. And I think a lot of what they say involves taking the actual interests of social struggles seriously. Not just reducing these struggles to what we might call trade union consciousness. Yeah, I mean that's a funny story about what Barnes said. It'd be nice if we had some trade union consciousness, but what we do have, I think, is both inadequate to that and exceeds it in many ways. So something like the George Floyd moment. We can't just say, oh well, that's just trade union consciousness, right? That's just like one struggle. That's not real consciousness. And sure, it wasn't a struggle for socialism, but it represents the real, to put it in McClowan Move's terms, the real democratic interests of millions and millions of people in society who are expressing an antagonism that the ruling class cannot contain. And that is where the responsibility of socialists becomes real. We can't just wait for workers to organize into what we think, trade union organizations should look like before we intervene. We need to look at what is actually happening on the ground in society, how consciousness is already expressing itself, in order to engage in a real pedagogical process that exceeds just this merger formula. And I think that, so you brought up Podemos. I've actually been reading this dissertation from a CUNY student on Podemos, which is very interesting. And it invites into the conversation also a conversation about language. And I know that I shared this Jean-Jacques Lecercle essay with you before this stream.
Yeah, I do want to get to that at some point.
Yeah, maybe we don't have to get into it right away. But I just think that it's such an important component of the hegemonic struggle, language, because we find ourselves not just in a political conjuncture, but a linguistic conjuncture, where linguistic interventions matter and have political effects. And I think that our reluctance to engage in the struggle over language is actually a symptom of some of these backward ideas of hegemony that we're still running with. We can circle back to that soon. But so you also brought up Gramsci, and he's kind of a haunting figure in Shandro's book. And I think that we do need to have a critique of hegemony and socialist strategy of McClowan Move. And I think that critique is basically what they want to excise out of Gramsci, which is this understanding that there really is a ruling class, that there really is an irreconcilable antagonism that represents a kind of, to put it in Zizek'ian terms, an unconscious that keeps returning. The class struggle is this unconscious element in society that reappears in these symptomatic ways. I think one way you can see this is Tucker Carlson's recent videos and interviews. He showed up at this Turning Point conference and he said things that you would expect to hear from a left populist. And these are class-oriented interventions that he's making. Why can't my kids be expected to thrive in society? Why can't people expect to live a dignified life? Why is technology only making us addicted to screens and not improving our lives? I think there's something fundamentally at play here that has to do with class. And I think that, as a Marxist, we basically have faith in this thesis, right? That what we're looking at is this irreconcilable antagonism. It has all these symptoms that we can recognize, and that constitutes the ultimate strategic groundwork for the struggle that we're engaged in, which takes on all of these contingent forms, which cannot be reduced to that antagonism at the highest level of abstraction, but have to be taken on their own terms. And I think that's the real trauma of hegemony that Marxists have to engage with, is that you're never in a safe space when you're organizing for socialism. You're always on the terrain of an enemy who has mastered the conjuncture before you, and who has articulated these spontaneous struggles before you. And the question is, can you organize to articulate these struggles in a way that forwards proletarian hegemony at the expense of bourgeois hegemony? Yeah, so I think I'll...
No, that's good. That's really powerful in a certain way. This Leninist contribution, I mean, one of the things that Shandro brings out that I appreciate a lot in his book on Lenin here, sort of this idea that Lenin is not only thinking, he's thinking actually multiple forms of spontaneous, quote unquote, spontaneous consciousness. He usually distinguishes it between bourgeois and socialist spontaneous consciousness. And the task, of course, is to avoid, obviously, the co-optation of bourgeois spontaneous consciousness, which would, in a way, you could sort of theorize that as the way that bourgeois ideology absorbs and perverts popular struggles, right? This kind of, because Lenin has the notion that the predisposition of every worker will be towards socialism, right? Now, within the spontaneous consciousness of socialism, you then get introduced to the Menshevik-Bolshevik division. And Shandro has a really nice chapter on the Menshevik-Bolshevik division that I found pretty interesting and pretty clarifying. I might ask you to say a couple of things about that. I felt that in a certain way, Shandro is sort of helping me understand, I think at this point, and this sort of takes us back to the wider debate about the Marxist unity group that you're putting forward as well. I guess you could say sort of like, how does one remain true to Leninist principles in today's time? Like, in other words, what are some of like the contemporary avatars, if you will, of Menshevism? Because if the, and I think you're right to say this, the terrain of socialist struggle is one in which the enemy is ever present, you know, because there's another thing that is important. I'm trying to sort of weave together this conversation with Shandro in our own moment. There's another very interesting thing happening in the background of our own moment, which is the dissolution of another Marxist entity that you were, I don't know if you were a part of it, but you write about it. It's called the Marxist Center. I might invite you to say something about the dissolution of that effort, why it dissolved, what it was, but also like what lessons you derived from that dissolution of the Marxist Center. And maybe you could say something about how or whether you agree that this kind of Leninist distinction between Menshevism and Bolshevism still sort of permeates, or is still sort of like a valid framework for thinking ideological divisions. How is that the case? And how would you sort of piece that together? And also tell us about the Marxist Center. I don't think many people remember it. It dissolved in 2019. Is that right?
I think it dissolved a little after that, but it didn't last long. It started in 2018. And I wasn't a part of it, but I did read, there was some good writing that came out of it. One of the articles I really liked that came out of it was Teresa Callas's article, Everyday Ruptures. And so it was an interesting experiment in which we could see a lot of different theories of hegemony colliding. But I actually agree with the Marxist Unity Group's appraisal of this project and their critique of it, which is basically that a direction was not set. And I think that, and this reminds me of something you said earlier about class independence. I think the more important category that we need to work with, if we're going to use Shandro's frame, is strategic independence. And I think that strategic unity is just a much more useful way of thinking about effective unity on the left. And there wasn't strategic unity in the Marxist Center. There was a sort of diffuse ideological unity around principles that you could generally identify as socialist enough for many different tendencies to participate. But it sort of devolved into, as I understand it, and I'm no expert on it, but it sort of devolved into a sort of base building project without a center, ironically. And I think that's what happens when you do not take up this responsibility, which I think we could call the Bolshevik responsibility of leading the social struggles of the day. And, you know, I think here is where maybe we could talk a little bit more about DSA. This is sort of a...
Wait, one clarifying question.
Sure, yeah.
Was the Marxist Center, it was not a DSA-centered effort?
No.
Right.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Right. And I think Marxist Unity Group ultimately joined DSA after the Marxist Center.
Yeah,
failure,
that's right. That's right.
I understand.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right. Okay.
And so, yeah, so to me, the failure of the Marxist Center is reflective of this refusal of the Bolshevik challenge of leading other classes, leading other sectors, leading the spontaneous struggles, which do not immediately appear to us as proletarian struggles in the here and now. And I think this is, and that is a very good chapter in the book, which compares Menshevism and Bolshevism, one of my favorite chapters.
It's very interesting.
It really clarifies a distinction that I think is very murky, for at least it was for me until I read this book, about what really is the distinction. And I think it is the comparison between a strategy of patience and a strategy of action, for lack of a better term. And I think that there are some avatars, certainly of Menshevism and of Bolshevism. I like, and I think I included in my article there on Cosmonaut, I like the example of Venezuela a lot. And this figure of Luis Miquelena, who theorized the possibility after the kidnapping of Hugo Chavez and his miraculous return after, you know, the people in the slums came down to demand his return and surrounded the government building where his captors had, you know, seized. And in the aftermath of this event in 2002, the PSUV party basically was in a position where they're like, well, maybe we need to like grab more hegemony over other sectors so that we can isolate this Fede Cámaras, or this Chamber of Commerce, which is highly aligned with the United States, in order to actually advance our project. And so they theorized this idea of the productive bourgeoisie, the empresarios productivos, who were not aligned with imperialist ambitions of US corporations. They were not aligned with these larger political questions. They just wanted to do things like transportation in the country of Venezuela. They were not a political enemy. They were, you know, simple, small and middle capitalists in the country. And so government contracts were given to these people instead of like these arch enemy corporations in an action that I think was a very Leninist gesture of assessing the concrete analysis of the concrete situation. And recognizing who is a real enemy and who can be won over to a project, at least in the near and intermediate term. So I think, you know, Luis Miquelena is an interesting figure, and he really was a thinker of hegemony. And he even said, he was even critical of using the term socialism in Venezuela. He didn't like 21st century socialism as a moniker. He is like, we need to, why are we still using this? Why aren't we just doing the thing that we want to do and using the language that makes sense to people, as opposed to, you know, enforcing this old slogan or this old concept on the moment. So that sort of open-mindedness, that sort of daringness to seize the moment, to fight for hegemony over the actual sectors and interests that exist, I think was well exemplified in Venezuela.
And the thinker you're talking about is Linera?
In this case, it was Luis Michelena.
Michelena. Ah, Linera
Yeah,
is
yeah.
another figure that you...
And there's another figure, Linera, who was the former vice president of Bolivia,
Right.
who has
Right,
written
right, right,
some
right.
very, very interesting things. And I think he was certainly influenced by Laclau, but absolutely maintained his Marxist commitments. And I think you can see in him, in that figure, the real benefits that come with this challenge put forward by the left populism, combined with
Yeah.
the commitment to Marxism.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky point, because I think you're absolutely correct from a kind of theoretical point of view that the Laclau move intervention, everyone should sort of read it. I think that it obviously hasn't aged well in the wake of certain social movements that took their inspiration from the Laclauian, framework, and most notably being Occupy Wall Street. It hasn't aged well, primarily, I think, because there was a kind of embedded error in the Laclauian view, which was extremely pronounced. And it was the notion that, well, yeah, Marxism is too focused on the working class, and that it creates like a kind of false ontology. So there's like a philosophical excision of the centrality of the working class in Laclauian left populism. And I think that's the heart of its decline as irrelevant. But where, we can, like, everything has to be assessed in the what I call balance sheet, right? It's not like you ever reject something to court. I think it's silly to do so. But I think what you're trying to suggest is that, and this kind of again dovetails to some of your criticisms of Marxist Unity Group, right? Which is the task of building socialism is an ideological one, right? Because we'll get to this whole point about how the Marxist Unity Group sees the Constitution, for example, as the sort of central impediment to actually practically doing socialist politics. And your response is interesting. You say, no, actually, an answer that would be more true to Lenin would actually be to construe the task as an ideological one. And here, post-structuralist theory becomes important. Althusser, Lacan, all of these, right? And here I tend to agree with you. I think the critique of ideology has to take post-structuralism very seriously. Perhaps there is a tendency for some more orthodox Marxists to reject post-structuralism. Oddly enough, of course, a thinker like Moishe Postone fundamentally seemed to reject post-structuralism. So there is this kind of reductive either-or approach or thinking, like, oh, this system of thought is flawed, let's just get rid of it. No, I think we can have a more constructive reading. So all of that is to tee you up for a question as to what you meant when you said that you liked Laclau and Mouffe's intervention, right? And of course, people, I think in our last stream, were asking what are good critiques of it. I didn't mention Ellen Maskin Wood in her book, The Retreat from Class. That's a classic critique that has kind of been slept on, but then more recently rediscovered. I'm happy to articulate and summarize that. But why don't we first start with saying a little bit more, because I think it helps us get at this question of the crisis of ideology, maybe, which is if you don't resolve or figure out the ideology question, you can't really build much in terms of this wider point you're making about cross-class alliances as being necessary. So is that right, that you really found it that the ideology piece is so important in their work?
Yeah, but I think there, okay, so the one thing that Shandro doesn't quite fully get to is this responsibility of the popular articulation. He's very good about like the responsibility of coming up with a strategy that puts the necessary pieces together in the conjuncture. But the actual way that that's done requires this intervention of the popular articulation, the translation of the strategy into popular language, which has to take seriously ideology, which has to take seriously the common sense, to put it in Gramsci's terms. And I think it is this insistence on articulation that I really love about Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, the book. And here I think we have to talk about language. I mean, it's just very difficult not to. I don't know if you want to go there yet.
I do. I think it would actually be quite relevant, and maybe we could. Yes, that was another thing. I was so immersed into Shandro, but 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I had read this very interesting, relatively short piece. I shared it in our Patreon for Emancipations if folks are interested. It's an essay called Lenin the Just on unrecycled Marxism, something like that is the subtitle, by Jean-Jacques Lecercle. He's a very interesting figure. He's a linguist. He obviously, well, he's sort of one of these 68 generation thinkers. And so naturally he had to face the rise of the new left, student activism, and this pernicious situation in France where you had a left that tried to say, well, we can go farther left than Marxism, right? Obviously, we've been, I think, recoiling from that influence, and it doesn't have much strength on the left today, thankfully. But in his essay, he confesses that Lenin kept him true to Marxism, and that it had to do with Lenin's theory about how one, a socialist theorist, let's say, or the workers' struggle, creates a slogan. And it's an interesting analysis, I think, really of one essay by Lenin, a lesser-known essay, if I'm not mistaken, about how Lenin sort of like, here's how to construct a slogan that appeals to the masses. And that's actually one of the things that the Laclauian approach is about, right? Which has good and bad side, because to sort of think as a hegemony thinker, one does need to think about that relationality of language. And so that let's do it. Let's introduce this essay, Lenin the Just. What's it all about, and how does this language piece come into play?
Yeah, it really is, I think. And yeah, I actually don't know how to pronounce his name. I mean, these guys are very marginal, unfortunately, in the discourse. Shandro, and I have been pronouncing it Lecercle, but I don't speak French. Now, he calls himself an Anglophone. He might speak English. You might be able to get him for one of your sessions.
Is he still living? I'm not too familiar with him.
He's
very interesting.
I think he's in his late 70s. Yeah, he's still around.
Wow.
Yeah. And the book that inspired that essay, he wrote a book called A Marxist Philosophy of Language,
right?
Which is a phenomenal book. And yeah, so he thinks that Lenin's real contribution is that he displaces the emphasis within Marxism on the general principles over to the reading of the conjuncture and of the tactical intervention, which includes the slogan. And the slogan for him is so his theory of language is a response to what he calls the dominant ideology of language, which is that if you ask anybody, if you ask Marxists, what do you think language is? You'll often hear the answer, well, it's a tool for communication. And this was actually Stalin's position on language. He didn't think language was part of the superstructure. He thought it was outside of the superstructure, because when they had a revolution in Russia, he was like, look, our language didn't really change. And for Lecercle, that's not really right. He says that language has a lot of different components which have different temporal logics. And so they're not going to, change overnight. But every time you make an utterance, you are changing language. So you are both interpolated by language. He's an Althuserian, so he follows this chain of interpolation that Althusser puts forward. You are interpolated, you are spoken by language, but you are also a speaker with a style, and you counter-interpolate when you speak. And so the utterance is kind of like an active mirror of language, an active reflection, he calls it. And so we both are spoken and we speak. And when we do that, we change something fundamentally in however small a way about the linguistic conjuncture. And so from that perspective, language is really a site of struggle. And the way we speak can actually change the conjuncture. And so the slogan, I think it is quite relevant to Laclau and Mouffe's argument. The slogan is a way of putting together in Laclau and Mouffe's terms, chain of equivalences. These alliances that are latently possible but haven't been articulated yet can be articulated in the slogan. And this can fundamentally change the way that people think of themselves as subjects, the way that they think of their positionality in a conjuncture. And yeah, so I think that is one of the coolest contributions that Lecercle has made theoretically. And I think it's so rich for us to think through this challenge of the slogan. And I think it's so obvious how poor our choice of slogans has been, with some exceptions. I think the Mamdani campaign is an absolutely brilliant example of how the use of language can be powerful and can constitute forces that before were totally scattered.
Did you have any specific points within that out of curiosity? Like when you're looking at Mamdani's campaign, and also what do you think accounts for that with his campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I said this provocatively, and it is provocative, and I don't know if I totally agree with it, but I think given all the concerns that we're raising right now about the tasks and responsibilities of socialist intellectuals, I think that the campaign staff for Mamdani is the vanguard right now. I mean, the messaging that campaign has done, using language okay, so one of the things I brought up earlier was this counter-interpolation. This is a key concept in Lecercle. The counter-interpolation rejects the place that you're assigned by the interpolation. So when Mamdani is asked, you've said before that billionaires shouldn't exist. Can you defend that? And what he says is, well, I think that's actually the wrong question. I think the right question is, do working people have the right to exist? Right? That's a counter-interpolation.
Right.
And that flips the script in a way that where someone was just in this passive position of oh yeah, maybe billionaires deserve their money or whatever. Now suddenly they're like, well, wait a second, what about my experience?
Right.
What's going on here?
Mm.
And just the absolute undeniability of something for a New York you can afford, right? Nobody should be priced out of a dignified life. These are not Marxist phrases. These are just logical phrases that advance the interests of the proletariat, right? In a concrete way.
Right. No, it's really good. It's really good. I mean, in a way, I feel like the merger formula debate we were having before intersects with the problem of language and sloganeering, right? Insofar as one of the problems of left populism, right, I think had to do with the idea that the people making the sloganeering, making the slogans, let's say, and we saw, I think, this definitely with Occupy Wall Street, for example, and maybe to some extent with BLM, we're kind of at ease to mirror, I don't know, corporate slogans, for example. Famously, this figure, Micah White, who declared himself the entrepreneurialization of social movements, right? that immediately does emerge as some type of problem, which becomes a problem, I think, of entrepreneurial intellectuals pose a certain danger to the construction of slogans, in the sense that they become highly adventurous and detethered from institutional class standpoints, right? So I think that, for all of its limitations, for all of its flaws, the DSA is the kind of most robust institution for socialism right now that we have available. And I imagine that is why you insist upon being a member, despite the fact that you are probably at odds with the leadership in a lot of instances, in a lot of scenarios, right? How is the DSA doing right now, by the way? Could you perhaps provide a general assessment? Obviously, the Mamdani campaign gave it a bit of a boost. But how is the DSA looking in terms of its overall health now that we're in a second Trump presidency and facing these kinds of challenges right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to answer that in just a second, but before I forget,
we'll come back to the language piece and the theory, but I just reminded me.
Sure. Yeah. Well, maybe I can just answer that right now. I mean, I just joined earlier this year, after this long process of figuring out what I think the real responsibilities of socialists are in the United States. And yeah, I don't think DSA is in great health. I think we get big influxes of members, like New York now has 10,000 members after the Mamdani campaign, which is quite impressive.
10,000 new?
No, I think total members.
Total.
They're up to 10,000. Yeah.
Got it.
And, nationally, I think we're still below 100,000 members.
Right.
But I think that despite these influxes, the DSA is not clear enough about what it is. And it contains antagonistic elements that produce unproductive antagonisms in the organization. And I think that the left and right, if we can use those terms of the organization, do not work well together. I think they have fundamentally different strategic visions for what DSA should be. And I've made some interventions in the DSA forums, which I think DSA needs some more serious ways of establishing a discourse within its organization. But we have these member forums. They're like 90s style web forums where you can just comment on anything, And I think that there's limitations to what we can accomplish when we don't have strategic unity. And I think that the left critiques the DSA for working within the Democratic Party. And actually, I think this is one of the things that Shandro provides. One of the benefits of Shandro's intervention is to get away from fetishization of certain elements of the terrain of struggle. Like, that's just enemy territory. We can never touch that thing. That's going to be poisonous no matter what we do. And this over here is our safe space where we can organize, our own third party that's never going to be infiltrated or affected by bourgeois interests. I think that's the kind of the position of the left, is that touching the Democratic Party is effectively giving ourselves over to it. And if we create a third party, an independent party, that'll be this kind of magical paradise where we can do whatever we want, even though it's an uphill battle to get on the ballot and whatnot. And I think that that's a little bit naive. And I don't want to get into this full debate now, but I think that we have to get away from these notions of something in the strategic terrain being off limits completely. We have to entertain every sort of possible site for struggle. And I think that there's just this fundamental deadlock within DSA about whether to involve ourselves in the Democratic Party, which I think is disingenuous because that is what we are already doing. We are already, even the left has to admit that the Mamdani campaign was a massive success. It's still obviously not won, and that was a product of running in a Democratic primary. And so I think that this is one aspect of DSA that I wish were kind of developed a little more, to the point where we could kind of admit what we are and be that thing more fully, which is kind of an electoral vehicle that articulates popular struggles into one project.
Yeah.
And I think if we were that thing fully, it would be much healthier for the leftist ecosystem broadly, which will always exist, right? There will always be the left, there will always be the right, but I don't see why those two things have to coexist in the same organization in this way that's unproductive. I mean, that's a bigger conversation.
Sure.
But to go back to some of the language stuff,
please.
One of the things Lecercle says about the slogan is that the slogan, unlike the corporate slogan, is capable of having a truth effect. A truth effect, which I really like. So the corporate slogan is always this kind of manipulative interpolation, even when it appears to be subversive. And he's got this example in his book of, he remembers when he was younger, this billboard in the French metro station that had this large text, right, that said, "This woman is good, ... And in your head, you're already filling in the blank, right, with this kind of sexist trope. But it says, "in her job," right? And so what he liked about that corporate slogan is that it's acting subversive while reinforcing both our preconceived sexist notions through this, common saying, and kind of interpolating us into the workplace as like, be good at your job. That's how you be a productive member of society. That's how you be progressive, a progressive member of society. And so the corporate slogan always does this. It always interpolates you, whereas the slogan counter-interpolates. And so one example he gives of the corporate of the slogan is, and this I think relates to the common sense, right? For Gramsci, the common sense is this composite, anachronistic, sedimented slate of ideas, right? It's not just bourgeois logic, although that's operative, surely. It's this strange, contradictory mass of ideas. And in there are these proverbs that everybody knows that function as like a common logic. And one of these proverbs is, pride comes before the fall. And so for Lecercle, a slogan could be something like, a counter-interpolating slogan could be something like, pride comes before a vote of impeachment, right? So you're taking this proverb and people are ready to fill it in with the just thing that changes nothing about society at all, changes nothing about your ideas. And then it fills it in with this edge, this knife that comes in at the end and transforms that proverb into something active, to something that actually changes the situation. One more example, my brother wrote this book recently called Teach Truth. And this is about the right-wing attack on public education. And he talks a lot about Chris Rufo, right? As one of these right-wing figures, the suit and tie conservative.
Or the anti-woke guy.
The anti-woke guy, who everywhere he goes, he fear-mongers about critical race theory, right? Like,
right.
Your kids are being taught critical race theory. And if you're an educator who is teaching a critical pedagogy, you hear that and you feel interpolated, right? Like, oh, I'm one of these people that's like telling lies to kids, right? Mm-hmm. That's like, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I'm going too far. Maybe, And my brother says in his book, well, Chris Rufo is an uncritical race theorist, right? So, Chris Rufo is not this master of objective truth. He has a theory about race. It's just an uncritical theory. Right? And so I think that's a counter-interpolation. And I think that's the creative that's the thing that this Lecercle and even I think the Laclau and Mouffe argument unlocks for us, which we can have a lot of fun with at the same time that we recognize it puts us on terrain where we're unsteady, we're unsure, we've never dealt with this exact problem, these exact forms of logic, common sense before. But I think that's kind of the exciting challenge that we need to take up, basically.
Yeah, it is. It is like a political communicative strategy that calls for some type of, I don't know, reorientation of common sense. And I think this notion of substitution is an important one, where you sort of take a kind of almost like a kind of an embedded zeitgeist, or sort of like this kind of, even like if you were to take, I don't know, like let's say the ideology of meritocracy, I don't know, as an example. And we all know that it is a kind of natural American bootstrap ideology, but we also know that it's like terroristic on people, and it's like it produces despair, and like it's like false, and like bourgeois ideology almost could be defined as doubling down on falseness and the error of that, like over and over and over, and that creates a certain repression. And so if as socialists we're not capitalizing, so to speak, on that repression, on that anger and that righteous rage that we have, but we're not allowed to speak or identify, I think that's the type of use of language that needs to be galvanized by socialists. And in a way, you almost need like socialist like script writers or like playwrights that would be able, in a Brechtian sense, to perform like what is it, like, yeah, like the alienation effect, but on like a higher scale in a certain way. Now, to its credit, we should admit that Jacobin magazine has been in the business of sloganeering. Its op-eds, you can just tell, and I think much respect goes to them, even though, as you also know, they like to make the abolitionist left very upset, because they often like to appear, or maybe not like to appear, but they often do appear as more right-wing than spontaneous consciousness. I think that's true. And I think that's another point too, right? Which is like, I was reading Jasper Burns's new book on the Paris Commune in relationship to the George Floyd uprising. And it's, he's a communization theorist. He's a California communist. Rest in peace, Joshua Clover. Varn and I did a whole stream where we talk about his work. But one of the things I realized in his work and in Clover's work and in the ultra left, right, and in some aspects of the abolitionist left, is I noticed that, and maybe you disagree with this, but for them, like, communication doesn't matter as much, and I don't know. I feel like communication does matter a lot. It matters a lot. And we're in this constant process of learning from the now the other question would be like, okay, so what's your theory of institutional mediation and party mediation? Because a moment ago you said something interesting that I want to go back to, actually, which is that the debates about clean break or dirty break from the Democratic Party are a little bit naive. What did you mean by that? In a certain way, are you suggesting that we don't want to, I don't know, maybe like repeat the boomer situations, like, oh well, let's just create a new Green Party, or let's something like that? I mean, we're obviously well aware, and I don't necessarily take the same, I don't know, fatalistic view of say Benjamin Studebaker, where it's like, well, if you actually look at it from a political theory and legalistic point of view, the notion of us even being able to, and he creates this thought experiment. I don't know if you read his book, by the way, which is like, the only way that a third party could ever be created is if socialists forge an alliance with an oligarch. Like, if we get our own billionaire to fund us, and then, they could then put us in the driver's seat of sloganeering, which I think is equally naive. But what did you mean when you said, because I think for some, the DSA cannot be taken seriously because it represents in a crude sense, a kind of PMC management that is beholden to the Democratic Party and the wider NGO network and so on. And it will kind of always be thus. That would be its right wing, right? But let's go back to this question of the Democratic Party, because I think when talk about DSA, it is, like it or not, the elephant in the room. How do you approach that question at this moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that this debate, this dirty versus clean break versus realignment, I guess those are the three main positions. Although I don't think realignment is really an adequate description of what the right wing in DSA actually thinks, or of the predominant leadership in DSA actually thinks. This debate to me is very
realignment being the Michael Harrington theory from the get-go.
Right. Change the Democratic Party, right?
Which is really Bhaskar Sankara's,
I see, but
approach.
I think what even Bhaskar would say, I hope, is not that we want to totally, and we think realistically our goal is to totally reform the Democratic Party. I think the idea is that, Democratic Party is recognized as a legitimate institution of political power by masses of people who hold many of the same ideas that we do, that want all the things, for example, that Mamdani is talking about, right? Cheaper groceries, childcare, better public transportation, freeze the rent, right? Basic stuff. All these people recognize the Democratic Party not as this great party that is representing all their interests, but the only thing that they recognize as institutionally powerful enough to make any policy possible, basically. And so to just decide that we're not going to participate in this thing that the common sense holds up as an institution of power, of legitimate state power, I think is really shirking our responsibility, and in a way that, is naive. Because I just think all the same, if we go back to Shandro, all of the same challenges that we think are unique to the Democratic Party are going to reappear in our effort to build a third party. I mean, you talked about the Green Party, right? They spend all of their time trying to maintain the ballot access that they have. Why do we think that the bourgeoisie is going to allow us to freely organize in any area of society? I mean, that doesn't take seriously the problem of ruling class hegemony, and all of the tools at their disposal that they can employ to frustrate our efforts. And so I think that we need to think instead from the beginning about what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that if you put the pieces together that have come out today, I think they involve basically three things. One is the interpretation of the situation. And here already, I think we are kind of failing to interpret the situation as what it actually is. And here I kind of align actually with the more pragmatic elements of the DSA. That the Democratic Party is a fundamental feature of the landscape that we cannot circumvent. An interpretation of the situation, all of the strong and weak points of our enemy, all the frustrations of people who are brought into this hegemonic pact by the ruling class, class forces, crisis points, all these things. Number two, the development of a strategy. So the coordinated exploitation of these weak points, the avoidance of the strong points, the establishment of a winning coalition, the alliances, and then the popular articulation of the strategy. And so to me, my naivete Yeah, I think every Marxist has to have, it's constitutive of being a Marxist that you have some naive element, right? Otherwise, you would never wake up and do this every day. My version of this, for the neo-Kautskians, I think it's the idea that the working class will, because of capitalist development, consolidate itself, right? In this future imagined pure crisis of the bourgeoisie and proletariat. With, of course, the pedagogical efforts of Marxists along the way. But that's, I think, the naive element of the neo-Kautskian perspective. The Trotskyist perspective, this fantasy of the insurrection and the permanent revolution. For me, the fantasy is charisma, that by sheer force of will and our own cunning as strategic actors in the landscape, we can produce a project that is so overwhelmingly popular and compelling that these things that we thought of as impossible obstacles suddenly become exposed as riven with weaknesses, right? And I think that is, if we're serious, if we're really thorough about what we're trying to do with this popular articulation, we can expose these weaknesses. We can expose that the Democratic Party is not this fetishistic object of impossible terrain, but is actually, something that we can at least split in a moment where that becomes possible. After we've developed the kind of credibility, popular, credence that could lead us to that point.
Very interesting point. I was saying yesterday that perhaps the fact that the right has not been able to successfully run their campaign of Islamophobia against Mamdani is actually a testament to the collapse of liberalism as an efficacious worldview and ideology. And I think that in that collapse, which has been, depending on how you historicize it, has been a collapse and a crisis for quite a long time. I had I think a really good conversation in stream with Daniel Bessner about the crisis of liberal ideology. It's perennial, right? It's kind of constant. It's a chronic crisis. Within that space, socialist ideas do appeal to the common sense. Lenin is right about that. I don't know that we need charisma or charismatic leaders necessarily, because I think rather the task would be about this idea of scaling out a type of sort of ideological campaign in a certain way that would be able to more adequately allow socialist ideology to resonate with the masses. And the masses understood not in some totally narrow sense as the working class, because then we get into the sociological conundrum of like, how in the hell are we defining the working class? And one of the things you insist upon as a Leninist is that Lenin saw that the working class must take the mantle of leadership, but that in order to do so, it must forge these necessary alliances with non-proletarian elements of society. And I do want to invite you at some point in this conversation to define and maybe carve out what non-proletarian elements that we would be able to stomach alliances with. Also, what non-proletarian elements of society would resonate with our charisma, which again, our charisma, I don't think should be thought through personages, but perhaps more through our ideas. You know what I mean? Right? I think like maybe to go back to this, how are you pronouncing his name?
Lecercle?
Lecercle. To go back to, we'll find out later if that's correct, or somebody in the chat can confirm it. I put the link to his essay, which is a beautiful essay, by the way. Because, again, part of what I'm interpreting about his idea of Lenin's theory of sloganeering, it's not that depersonality becomes the object of identification. Like, that would be like a little bit too like Jack London. Like, Jack London is an interesting figure in American socialism to study. As his biggest flaw was the charisma piece, actually. right? I think a lot of anarchists will say it's like racism, and the racism, of course, is a problem, but it's very much a testament to his time and social Darwinism and Nietzscheanism, oddly enough. But he also had a vision of socialism, which was built upon this notion of working class heroism, right? And this idea that workers have this sort of unique articulability of social suffering, and we can kind of elevate that. And even the bourgeoisie can, and this is one thing that Shandro also talks about, is that class consciousness for the proletariat, because they are a dominated class, also entails class consciousness of bourgeoisie simultaneously. And we often lose sight of that. We often think that proletarian class consciousness is some silo, you know? But in a society like ours, which is so heterogeneous in terms of class, where sociologically we have a certain ambiguity about working class subjectivity itself, it's really actually not wise for socialists to think this sort of subtracted, you know what I'm saying? Like that whole business that Lukács says about, well, the proletariat has a unique vantage to the totality, I think is really smart and cool and interesting, because it's tied to his wider theory of reification and the way that the labor power of workers is unique, forms a unique site of alienation that can be converted into something positive for workers. That's what class consciousness dialectically reveals in a certain way. So anyways, I guess my point about charisma is I think it's interesting you say it's your one naive point of view, but maybe you could say something more about that. Are you understanding charisma like in this way where it's more like our ideas are what's magnetic about our movement? That's how I would want to think of it. I would not want to think about it like maybe how the Second International thought about it, where it's like, oh yeah, Big Bill Haywood was this mythical figure, or Jack London was this mythical figure, or Rosa Luxemburg was like, because then we fall into bourgeois ideology, and bourgeois ideology fetishizes genius, which is actually, I think, technically a kind of hangover of like a feudal form of fetishization. And I don't think socialists should ever really do that, which is ultimately why I'm opposed to, in the merger thesis, this idea of academics playing a big role, because I do think that there is probably an argument to be made that people will often forge identifications with authority through the existing division of labor that could actually undermine the socialist movement. And so the intellectual is probably going to be in a more dynamic position if they are not necessarily in a place of authority. Like intellectuals in places of existing capitalist authority, I think Maoism is very good on this, right? Are not necessarily your best allies for developing the repertoire of socialist communication and slogans and organizing. Anyways, let me be more precise. Let's go back to this point about charisma and pick this apart a little bit more. What do you mean by this, actually? And can we think of this almost like as like a rational theory, if that makes sense? Rational meaning like anti-humanist, like detethered from human persons, or is that not possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, here Gramsci has this moment in The Modern Prince where he says that the socialist program should be fought for dramatically. It should not be a cold and pedantic exposition of arguments. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. Podemos actually, you know, they did something interesting in Spain. They actually planned for the charismatic leader. That was part of their strategy, and they actually had one, right? Pablo Iglesias.
Yeah, I went to the same university that he went to in Switzerland.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very interesting figure, and I think he actually, of course, he's a deep theoretician. He's a pretty interesting theoretician in his own right. And you're right. And more recently, I think these their names escape me, but they have now seemed to really spotlight two very charismatic women who've been very excellent in the public sphere, advocating for the Palestinian cause. on social media, but also in like Spanish society and more generally. But you're right; they're very like charismatic leader centric.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that that's a good bet. It's very interesting. What I like is that they're willing to try it, right? Something like this just feels impossible in the United States with the ethos of the left right now. So at least they were willing to try it. But
Why do you think it feels impossible?
I think there's a deep suspicion of any kind of decisive leadership.
Well, that actually does go back to one of the things we didn't mention in the disillusion of the Marxist Center group, which is that in some of the reviews I was reading about the disillusion of that effort, they put blame on the activist left or the culture of the activist left. And I do think that, and I'm not, for all of the interesting stuff that they do, I think Sublation Media, for example, like Doug and Platypus as well, they almost think that the activist left or the left is the problem with everything. Everything is reducible to quote unquote the left or quote unquote leftists or leftism, which they see as like some kind of perverted ideology that's really far from the left ultimately. I think that critique has its limits, frankly. But so I don't want to say that it is not valid. Of course, it is valid to criticize the left. Anyway, sorry, I'm taking it. I think it's, all I was saying is that in our wider conversations, I think it's important that we throw that question onto the table. But feel free to go back to the charisma piece.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to become part of this entourage of just pummeling the left and blaming creating some straw man out of the left and taking shots at it. I mean, what we're working with is a common sense, right? Which, like you said, we don't exist in a siloed territory, either as the working class or on the left. We're already interpolated, right, into a logic. And we just have to deal with that. And so I think it is unrealistic to think that we can produce and plan for a charismatic leader here, which isn't necessarily good that we can't have that right away, maybe.
Or the other question would be, to what extent could the left produce like an charismatic leader, right? In the sense of like the like that figure who is a gadfly to, I don't know, like a kind of Socratic figure that sort of is good at making enemies. Like I guess you could say like the charismatic figure would be a figure who their value would have to be discovered in their capacity to name the enemy, but also to aggravate the enemy in a certain way. And I feel that you're right. Like critiques of the left ad nauseum, I think, run the risk of leading the masses to lose a trust in the idea of the left. And that is never something that we want to do. Or it risks our own cadre of intellectuals themselves losing trust in the meaning of the left. And then we risk abandoning the left, which, by the way, in Compact Magazine, this is exactly what happened with the so-called post-left. There was just a whole postmortem written by Oliver Bateman on the post-left, the death of the post-left, which to me comes as a profound relief that the post-left is now over, because I think many of us saw its rightward shift months ago. We saw it coming, and I think that's an inherent limitation to this constant berating of the left. But with all of that said, maybe you would agree, there are elements of the activist left that are, let's put it this way, maybe impervious to self-criticism, and that becomes its own unique problem. And I'm not sure exactly how to resolve that issue. Maybe in a way, it will is best resolved by not focusing on it too much, by not, because then you have a tendency to almost exaggerate it as a problem. So anyways, that you can say more about that if you wish, but perhaps return to the main thread on this Podemos charismatic leader. And you never really answered why you think it's impossible in the United States.
Yeah, I was just kind of regretting saying that. I think it is possible. And I think, even someone like Bernie Sanders was wildly popular. But I wouldn't necessarily call him charismatic. I think he's kind of doing what you're saying, which is just insisting on the articulation, right? It's the articulation itself that people find attractive. But I do think there's always going to be an identification with the figure who is transmitting the message. And I don't think we're always going to have an idea about what that sort of attachment is going to look like. We have to work with that kind of on the fly.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And I think that, earlier you said, like, you talked about enemies, articulating who the enemy is. And, one thing we didn't really get to yet today, which I talk about in that Cosmonaut article, and I'm still wrestling with this idea, but part of the popular articulation, and I do think that popular is the key term, and I think this is the thing that the post-left, I guess, is probably reacting to, is the willingness of the left to remain marginal. But instead of doing the positive version of that gesture, they're just attacking the left, which is itself, that gesture is a self-marginalizing act for the post-left to take on. And so this insistence on the popular, I think, is really something we have to take seriously, and drives us to a confrontation with the common sense and of ideology. And I think that part of this is defining the enemy not as capitalism as such, but as a particular enemy. And for me, the most corrosive element of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, is this parasitic finance sector that is so difficult to defend. It is undefendable, right? It is so in contradiction with the common sense, just basic, even conservative ethics, right? That, you should have just you should be able to live a dignified life if you work hard, right? I think that's a conservative idea. And it's this parasitic element that everywhere denies you of human dignity. I think I call the current U.S. state like the Firefest and Ticketmaster state, right? It's just this scam. Everywhere you look, you're being scammed. And there's another corridor of bureaucracy they have to walk through to get some basic service. This very bureaucratic, demeaning, parasitic entity, I think, is such an easy target for a leftist figure to take on. And I think that I'd like to see more of this even with the Mamdani campaign.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem to have identified an enemy.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think right.
That's a limitation. I think that can lead to some very unattractive alliances and ineffective alliances. Because once you have no enemy, once your enemy is just sort of things being bad,
right.
You lose your footing a little bit in terms of the strategic struggle that Alan Shandro is talking about.
No, brilliant. I think that's brilliant. And I think in a way, the rhetoric of Sanders was obviously misleading and betrayal ultimately, because on the one hand, he did give a kind of, some kind of thrust of the identification of the enemy. And he also gave a kind of full court press analysis, but ultimately on the one hand, it was too caught within this almost like fetish of the executive and this kind of, too quick fairy tale, and it led to a huge disappointment amongst the masses, and that harmed the cause of socialism in a certain way. Look, in our remaining time, we could talk more, and I want to invite you back to talk more about these finer theoretical points. And it's been very interesting to move from theories of language, the meaning of the slogan in Lenin, and everyone has to pick up Alan Shandro's Lenin and the Logic of Hegemony. I'll be writing about this book because it's actually really struck a chord in me. And again, just to reiterate, Shandro is kind of this theorist that's helping bring Lenin back into real political struggles, similar to Mike McNair and Lars Lih, who influenced neo-Kautskyism. But Kolya is sort of pointing out that actually, if you follow Shandro's thought, some of the conclusions are actually quite different than and now the way that this is manifested is through the Marxist Unity Group within the DSA. Now, in your piece, which I linked to in the chat for Cosmonaut, which I want to talk about now, you raise several very interesting criticisms regarding the core strategy of MUG, of Marxist Unity Group. Can you lay those out? I could summarize them, but it's probably better that you do so. And we'll just kind of talk through each of your general points. And some of them now should be a little bit fresher now that you're sort of influenced by Shandro's perspective.
Right. So you want me to go through the argument of the article, basically?
Yeah. Why don't you give the listeners kind of a lay of the article and your main arguments there?
Yeah. So I start by kind of doing my best to steelman the Marxist Unity Group argument, which is that the only form that the dictatorship of the proletariat can take is the democratic republic. And this is the conclusion of Mike McNair, who is taking up the logic of the German Social Democratic Party. He basically thinks we need to reproduce a party like that, where coercive forms of rule are not necessary, because by the time of the revolution, the democratic revolution, you've got this working class that is a majority in society, that is well organized, that is capable of legitimately wielding power. And the Marxist Unity Group thinks that we need this in the United States, and that the main obstacle is the Constitution. And so their conjunctural analysis is that we need to subvert the US Constitution. And I think that, my critique of this is basically that they have already made some strategic limits for themselves without really theorizing their legitimacy. I don't think that there's anything, ontologically necessary about a democratic republic for the workers to wield state power. And I don't think that there's a materiality to the Constitution that they think there is. And this goes back to kind of what I said about fetishizing the Democratic Party, for example. It's not this hard substance that can't be cracked. And so I just think we need to start with a much more open-minded framework. We need to take the thesis seriously that we're dealing with an irreconcilable antagonism. That's at the highest level of abstraction. That's the political struggle. There's two actors. There's the bourgeoisie and proletariat, and we're in this complex contingent social terrain that we're navigating. And I think this brings up the question of democracy. And I don't say it in my article, but Lenin's idea of democracy, I think, is interesting. I think what he shows is that a form of I think what he fought for is a form of democracy, which is winning the battle of consent before taking power. And taking power may not happen through a vote, right? It may just happen because you've already won the battle of consent, and the bureaucracy is already archaic, right? Because it was established under very different circumstances. And so what the people actually want is this new society through the slogan, right? The slogan is the Democratic Act. And the popularity of the slogan gives you a mandate to take power. And so I think they have a little bit of a narrow idea of what democracy is. And I think they get this kind of from Kautsky. And so I'm just inviting a much more open-ended conception of fighting for workers' power and of thinking through the concept of democracy. And I think that this involves a lot more of a traumatic confrontation with hegemony, basically.
Yeah. So it's very compelling. And I mean, I think everyone should read this publication here by the Marxist Unity Group, which I was just looking at earlier today. And I'd read, I think about a year ago, actually, Derek Varn gave it to me when he stayed at my place and we did a live event in DC last summer. I also struggle with the centrality of the Constitution in their argument. I think it's what I like about the Marxist Unity Group is that it's derived through rigorous theoretical debate and back and forth, and therefore they don't have just one primary theoretician. And there's something very sound in that process that I think is respectable. I think that the renaissance of work in academic Marxism that's looked at Marx and the Republican tradition is kind of the milieu that they're linking that to McNair's work on Kautsky and Lars Lih's argument, which maybe you could say something a little bit about in his work on Lenin and what is to be done, which really shows that, Lenin was, for the vast majority of his career, very much sort of forged in this certain relationship to social democracy that was informed by a Kautskiist strategy, by and large, and that it's kind of necessary to return to that form of Lenin. And then Shandro's point is like, yeah, I agree, but let's get that form of Lenin right. This early, like 1905 Lenin, right? So perhaps you could say a little bit more about this. I mean, it's very interesting because I think that there is a sense in which nationalism and the ideology of nationalism in America and patriotism, all of that, hornet's nest, right? On the one hand, the ultra left doesn't have a great answer to that problem, which is just like it's all fascism, right? But I'm not so sure the Marxist Unity Group also has a great answer insofar as, on the one hand, they want to do the Republican thing, like, fight on the terrain of the enemy. But then there seems to be, now, one thing I do really like, by the way, as a side point, is the very interesting proposal to reintroduce Marx's idea of the minimum maximum program in contrast to Trotsky's idea of transitional demands. I really thought that was interesting. I think that actually stands out. I don't know. I'm trying to remember, did you agree with that particular strategy or not on minimum maximum?
Yeah, well, I thought that when you had Ian Szabo on,
yeah,
he really defined, he helped me understand that minimum maximum program idea much better when he said that the gap between the minimum and maximum program is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I thought was a really nice formulation to kind of grasp what that means. Now, I think that there's something going on in the minimum maximum program as an ideal, and even in the transitional program. Although I guess if I had to align with one, I think I would probably align closer to the transitional program. Although I don't like these categories too much because the minimum maximum program is not reflexive enough. And I think that, this gets back to the slogan. The slogan is a reflexive, Lecercle talks about how the slogan that was correct yesterday is no good anymore today, right? And that means a total reformatting of what our program is. from moment to moment. And this does require some form of charisma, some form of like nimble, reflexive, responsive action.
It
And
does,
sometimes
but that's also let's also say this. That's also the birth of the most vicious revisionism that can, like get rid of things like the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So it's like, yeah, well, maybe we're not going to use this term dictatorship and so on, right? But I think too often that gives license or permission to actually remove the substance of the theory, which is something we don't want to do. So I think it's about this, right? This dance or this kind of necessary retainment of the substance of Marxist theory, which is something Lenin always put at the center of his project, with a kind of simultaneous awareness regarding the malleability of discourse and language as an instrument and a tool for galvanizing the popular masses. And what you really say in an interesting way in your piece on the Marxist Unity Group is that really it's, yeah, like you say, the struggle for ideology and the development of the consent of the working class as well as the masses that is more important than, yeah, the kind of locus of power as embodied in the Constitution and overcoming that or abolishing it. And many of the proposals of the Marxist Unity Group regarding abolition of bourgeois forms of power are, I think, thought in a way which strike me when I actually read this text of theirs and some of their collected work in Cosmonaut. Even though they have this kind of patient Kautskian strategy to work within the wider congressional parliamentary system, even though they have that, I do still feel that some of it is sort of unclear how these things are going to be abolished. So it does strike me as a bit of a feeling of immediacy. I'm not accusing them of ultra leftism or anything like that, but there's a little bit of that. But for you, yeah, it's really more winning the ideological struggle becomes the elevated problem. What do you think, though, about this new research from like William Clare Roberts and other work on Marx as a Republican thinker? And are you don't seem so convinced that this is like a necessary path for the socialist struggle to kind of adhere to? Is that sort of what you're suggesting there on the Republican piece?
That's a good question. I don't know the William Clare Roberts argument very well, but one thing I was thinking about when I was reading the Laclau Mouffe is like, what makes this constant symptomatic return of class so pronounced in society? And I think that it has something to do with this post-French Revolutionary moment, the post-Declaration of the Rights of Man, where the logic of democratic societies, so-called democratic societies, follows this language, right, of freedom, equality, brotherhood, which are in such antagonism to the prerogatives of capital,
Right.
That we can't stomach this antagonism without these symptoms, right?
That's actually one good way to understand humanism, like humanism as the locus of bourgeois ideals that have grown rotten. The false universalism of bourgeois ideals, which had their origin in the revolution, but which no longer have any rhetorical or discursive power, right? To invoke those humanistic ideals at a certain point, Marx and Engels recognized that it's playing the enemy's hand. It's doing the enemy's work for you. And I think Althusser, in his own way, is sort of saying something similar, which is like that's actually how you can understand anti-humanism in a certain way. I recognize we have just 2 minutes left, actually, because Kolya's got a hard out in a couple of minutes. But why don't we say this? There's more to be said on the Marxist Unity Group piece, and maybe I'll have a Marxist Unity Group member, like Donald Parkinson or others, onto my show for a response and a defense of their position, and maybe you might join me for that. it could be a comradely discussion. Would you be interested in that?
That would be amazing. I would love to see that sort of development of discourse that way. Because I think things can be lost. We have all these different online platforms. Only a few people are participating in them, in these debates. I do have a little bit more time, it turns out, but yeah, we don't have to stay much longer. I wanted to answer one other aspect of what you said. Okay, it was the risk of revisionism, right? And I just think there's no way out of this. Like this is the impossible scenario that we're in. That you have to basically choose where you're playing your hand. Like, are you gonna commit to this idea of the future clarifying crisis when all these formulas will be put into practice, the formulas of Marxism? Or are you going to participate in politics, in which case you're already always being co-opted by bourgeois power? There's just no way out of that deadlock, I think. I was talking to my dad a little bit about this. He was an old SDS member. He's a Marxist, and I was talking about how one of the frustrating things about Marxism today is this unwillingness to stray from the actual language used by Marx and Marxists of like 100 years ago, right? And his answer was, yeah, well, why don't we just speak German? Marx wrote in German. Why are we speaking English, right? So we're already translating. If we think about language in the way that Lecercle thinks about it, it's not just a absolute transposition from German to English. We're actually translating in a more profound way than that already.
Sure.
Because these words take on different meanings in different cultural contexts. So why not just take that more seriously and translate Marxism into a politics that actually resonates with people?
Yeah. That's fascinating. And what's the name of your brother's book, by the way?
It's Teach Truth. It is a Haymarket publication, and there's a subtitle to it that I can give you right now: Teach Truth and the Struggle for Anti-Racist Education.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to just thank everyone for the chat. Thank you, Kolya, for coming on and sharing your perspectives on socialism in the U.S. and this wonderful comradely critique of the Marxist Unity Group. I hope that Marxist Unity Group members benefited from hearing this perspective. I hope everybody reads Alan Shandro's book, Lenin the Logic of Hegemony, with H.M. Brill. Extremely thought-provoking work. It will likely change the way you see Lenin in a certain way. There's so many different angles and valences to Lenin's legacy, but this one is remarkable, I must say. Perhaps Alan Shandro may join Emancipations. We might have to reach out to Shandro.
Hell yeah.
And hopefully Kolya will come back on and join us for future study groups. And I got some exciting things on the horizon. Just want to remind comrades before we go that the second week of August, we're having a major symposium with Joan Kopjak, who is a very prominent Lacanian theoretician at Brown University. And she's going to come on to, as well as Nadia Bouali and Farhang Irfani, to talk about her new book on Kiarostami, Iranian cinema, Islam, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. The book is called Cloud: Between Tehran and Paris. And I've just started it, and I must say it's quite something. It's quite interesting. It's with MIT Press, Short Circuit series. So anyways, comrades, I hope everyone has a nice weekend. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Kolya, for your insights. Comrades, be well, and enjoy my little video here of Lenin statues as we end the stream. All the best.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel.
See you guys.